Chapter 8. I next roamed on to Swayambhunath, which lies 3 kilometers west of Kathmandu. Surrounded by a vast expanse of rice paddies, this beautiful hill is crowned with the Monkey Temple, an ancient Buddhist temple covered by a wide dome called a stupa and said to be built 2,000 years ago. The 8 eyes of Buddha on the base of the spire observe the 4 directions. These eyes were about to see something amazing. For no apparent reason, one morning I had an urge to walk to Kathmandu, so I left my reclusive abode on the mountain, wandered on foot to the city, and meandered through the streets and markets for a short time. Then I began to walk back to Swayambhunath through a long stretch of rice paddies, with its rich greenery and snowy Himalayan peaks piercing the sky. Kathmandu Valley is like a heaven on earth. As I walked along the narrow bank that enclosed the swampy paddy fields, tiny raindrops began to fall. Dark blue monsoon clouds thickened in the sky, obscuring the sun and promising to send down torrents. As the drizzle grew to a light rain, I looked around for a shelter, but saw not a single tree. Nothing but rice paddies stretched in all directions. Then, at a distance, I beheld the figure of what appeared to be an elderly man carrying an umbrella over his head. Hoping to share his umbrella, I scurried along the thin paddy border to catch up with him. The path was narrow and slippery, so I could not walk beside him. Instead, I nestled in behind. Struggling to keep under the umbrella, I repeatedly slipped down toward the soupy mud of the paddy. Meanwhile, the umbrella carrier never once turned around. Perhaps he was intimidated by my intrusion, or maybe he was concentrating on not falling into the pools of mud. In this anonymous way, we 2 strangers walked along together through the deserted and soggy fields for some time. 2 men alone in a vast paddy field, we shared a single umbrella as the monsoon poured down torrents. 10 minutes later, when the storm subsided, I offered thanks to the stranger. He turned around now for the first time to have a look at my face. Our eyes met. We were thunderstruck. Our mouths dropped open and eyes filled with tears. How could this be? For a moment, we stood motionless in a place outside of time. The umbrella dropped into the mud. "Gary!" I cried. "Monk!" Under the monsoon sky, hearts bursting with joy, we embraced. "We're together again," I said. There we stood, alone in a vast Himalayan valley, thrilled by the mysteries of life. From the time of our sad farewell on the Isle of Crete, we had walked our respective paths. Inseparable childhood friends, we'd been separated by destiny, and today that invisible puppeteer had pulled us together in an isolated rice paddy in Nepal. Reeling with joy, we strolled through the paddy fields toward the place Gary was staying, all the while exchanging our experiences since parting. Slipping and sliding on the narrow paddy bank, Gary walked in front and I close behind. "Did you ever make it to Israel?" He turned to me and stroked his beard, which had grown several inches since we last parted 11 months before. "After you left Crete," he explained. I worked on a fishing boat for my passage to Israel. I worked on a kibbutz for a while. Then, with some money in my pocket, I set out for India. How did you get here? I asked. He replied, I took the magic bus. He paused for a moment and began walking again. He described the cheap bus for down-and-out travelers that ran from Europe to India. After returning from Israel, he had boarded in Istanbul, crossed the Middle East, and got off at the end of the line in Old Delhi. And what brought you to this uninhabited rice paddy? I asked. The sweltering heat of Delhi was too much, Gary told me, still trembling with excitement. So with some friends from the magic bus, I came up to Kathmandu Valley and found a little house in the countryside. We approached the village and left behind the narrow borders of the rice paddies. I walked side by side with my old friend. A water buffalo trudged toward us on the sodden path, so we stepped aside to let her pass. Monk, Gary continued, I came to India with the hope to find you. But seeing the hundreds of millions of people in this vast land, I concluded it was impossible. I knew you would never be in the hangouts where travelers make the scene. I figured you were in some cave or secluded ashram. I never thought I'd see you again. Gary stopped and turned. His eyes widened, and he said, Nobody will ever believe this story. Nobody. It was August of 1971. Almost a year had passed since we'd parted in Crete. By my appearance, Gary could see that I had adopted the life of a sadhu. The arduous journey across the Middle East, the time spent in the company of enlightened yogis, and the many months in seclusion had left me as a seasoned ascetic. For good reason, Gary was hesitant to bring me to the place he was crashing with his friends. What happens when a Nepalese village home is rented to hippies of the West? As we entered the little structure, rock and roll music blared. Men and women danced seductively, and opium pipes were passed around in a cloud of smoke. Gary introduced me to his friends, all of whom I greeted politely. To say I could no longer identify with this scene was an understatement. I stood on the sidelines and watched. After some time, I took Gary aside, escorting him to a quiet place in an open field where we sat under a banana tree. A blanket of hovering clouds released a mist of cooling droplets. We breathed deeply the fresh mountain air, a welcome relief from the opium cloud inside. Although I feared being judgmental, I spoke openly to my friend. Gary, you have traveled across the world to come here. This is a land of spirituality. You have brought the hippie culture of the West with you. You could live like this in Chicago. You're just doing the same old things and more in a different setting. How will you grow? What will you gain? I pleaded with him in earnest. Please, brother, while you're in this part of the world, try to experience the wealth of spirituality here. If you agree, I'll take you to the holy places and teach you the life of a sadhu. Gary looked far into the horizon. Let me think about it. Come on, Gary, I pressed. Don't you remember when you begged me to go to Europe with you? I dropped all my plans and did it. Now I'm pleading with you to come to the holy places with me. I loved my friend, and it pained me to see that he came so far and was missing this precious opportunity. The next day, Gary said goodbye to his friends and entered into the school of spiritual mendicants. Together again, we began exploring the meaning of life by meeting new people in new places. But this time, we followed traditions that were long ago established by enlightened beings. Day by day, I taught my old friend how to survive in India as a spiritual seeker. How amazed he was to learn the method for hitchhiking in India, jumping into the window of a moving third-class train. I also shared with him the art of begging for simple food and dressing like a sadhu. An elderly Swami informed us about a pilgrimage to Amarnath, a famous cave situated high in the Himalayas of Kashmir. He said that any soul fortunate enough to complete the rigorous pilgrimage would be awarded great spiritual merit. Gary was ripe and ready for the adventure, and so was I. We set off. On the road again from Kathmandu, we returned to India, riding in the back of a truck to Raxaul and then on to Patna, where I introduced Gary to Ram Sevak Swami. Swami was thrilled to see me again and still carrying the stick he gave me. Gary looked on in wonder, amazed by the kind of friends I was keeping. From Patna, we traveled west by train. Gary was especially eager for a tour of Varanasi from a sadhu's perspective. While there, we visited the famous temple of Kashi Vishwanath in the early morning. Brass bells were ringing, hymns were chanted by the temple priests, and swirling pillars of incense smoke rose and dissipated into the air. I prayed, "My Lord, I long to know you and to love you. Please show me the path I must follow." Something happened to me at that moment. I was overwhelmed with a feeling of hope that if I only humble myself before the Lord, everything would be revealed. I felt that His hand was reaching out to me and that something very special was about to happen in my life. It was at the railway station in Varanasi that we squirmed into a train of compressed human bodies, crushed limb to limb in the sweltering heat of the monsoon. The whistle blew as the steam engine pumped up bellows of smoke and hissed out steam. The heavy steel wheels ground forward. The train lurched, and we were on our way. The monsoon storm was furious, converting an agricultural field into a muddy lake and paralyzing the engine. Hours passed in stagnancy. In the extreme heat, striving to set aside my physical discomfort, I longed to hear the whistle blow, signaling movement. Nearly 2 days later, the train inched out of the fields, and before dawn, halted at an unknown station. Gary and I escaped through a window and onto the platform for temporary relief before the journey continued. The fresh air was glorious. The dimly lit, crowded railway platform looked dirty and run down. To us, though, it was like a paradise, a place where we might find water to drink, air to breathe, and space to move our limbs. But while we were stretching, the whistle blew, The steam hissed and the train jerked forward. Frantically, we ran alongside the train to jam our bodies back in through one of the windows, but couldn't penetrate the masses inside. Window after window and door after door, we tried to claw our way in. Finally, the train disappeared down the tracks, leaving us behind. We stood there, stranded in an unknown place, not knowing how long it might be until another train came through. Gary looked at me and asked, "Now what?"